Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in here. It's about a couple weeks past midterm in our class, so we still have a few units, few weeks to go. But I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to just kind of say hi again, remind you that I'm here as a person, as a resource that you can reach out to if you have questions about our class, about specific course content, but really more generally, especially as we look to maybe you're registering for summer, or even starting to think about fall. I'm one of the chairs here in the English department, so I can be a really good resource for, again, what classes to take next, what kinds of majors or career opportunities are open to folks who focus on English, whether you're an English major or education major, or because of the sort of general skills that English provides in terms of creative problem solving, effective communication, learning to collaborate with one another, which is something that we've done in this course. Even though we're entirely online, that's a pretty valuable 21st century skill. So again, if you have questions about our course, feel free to reach out. Or if you have more general questions about English professions that are related to English, again, feel free to reach out. We can meet face-to-face if you're on campus, we can Zoom, and we can also just go back and forth via email as well. So I'm going to just share my screen though and talk a little bit more specifically about a couple of elements of our course. Nothing new here, but this is a good opportunity to sort of remind you of some of the global or overarching policies and ideas that we are working, kind of the constraints we're working within or the framework that we're working in, and also some of the goals that we've got, which I'll get to in a sec. So you're well aware of our due dates now. I'm not going to look at those, but I do want to remind everybody of our late work or my kind of like grading philosophy or grading policy. And again, this is available in the first column in Padlet if you want to check it out. But here's the gist of it. My my policy might seem a little bit drastic in terms of there's no late work accepted. So if you miss a due date, unless, I either don't notice, which totally can happen, or you're submitting like literally minutes after the due date, I probably won't notice that either. But if it's significantly late, then there's no credit provided. And anything beyond the end of our actual class, again, problematic. So this is obviously not going to affect or not covering things where you would actually work with our Office of Access and Accommodation if you had a medical thing come up or a serious family emergency, something like that. So that is obviously beyond the scope of what we're dealing with here. But again, if you just have a unit go wrong, if you forget a due date, if maybe you just don't do that well, so the grade isn't what you'd want it to be, remember, there's no kind of going back and fixing that. It becomes too hard for me to manage like who's doing what when, and then it's become sort of unequitable because, one person gets longer, the other people don't, et cetera, et cetera. So the flip side though, and this is why I want to remind everybody now as we get a little bit closer to the end of our course, is that at the end of the class, we'll have accumulated, or you'll have accumulated, lots and lots of, 25 point, 50 point, 50, 25, lots and lots of those relatively smaller point value kinds of things for each of the various things that we do within our units. So that gives me a really good picture of your work throughout the entirety of our class. So if you just happen to have a bad week where you either missed a due date, so it's a 0. You didn't quite understand an assignment, so it's a lower grade than you might like. Maybe you did the post, but you forgot to do comments or reply, something like that. These things happen. I get it. I'm human too. They happen to me. So no, you don't get credit for that. But I can clearly see the one or two times maybe that happened across the entirety of our class together is those are obviously outliers. So it takes till the end of our class until I can see that pattern. But once I can see it, I can see it. It's pretty obvious. It'll be obvious to you, and no matter what number Blackboard spits out in terms of calculating just your accumulated points, I can always see if there's just a couple of bad weeks that you had, in which case I can exempt those grades so they don't count against you at all. If, of course, missed work, kind of not doing too great, clearly there's not much time invested, If that's a pattern, then I can see that too, and truthfully, you can see it, and it's not really as subjective as some people might think. That clearly will have a negative impact on your grade. But the more common case and why the policy or the philosophy is the way it is that students, for the most part, do great. Maybe there's one or two off weeks that they have, but those are clearly, right, the exception and not the rule. And so my approach can account for those. We just account for it at the end of the semester when I can see the big picture, rather than trying to make up work as we go along by adjusting due dates or providing extensions and all that kind of stuff. Becomes too complicated. It doesn't really help you in terms of learning to get things done on time. And it provides, or it produces possible inequalities when, again, someone's getting extension, someone's not, someone gets this much, someone gets another, whatever. Too complicated. Again, for something really serious, I would direct you to our Office of Access and Accommodation here on campus. They can deal with paperwork, they can deal with stuff like that. But those are for like fairly extreme cases. So I wanted to make sure that this was kind of on your radar as we approach the last few units in our class together. The other thing, and one of the most enjoyable parts of my job, honestly, is getting to see all of the various creative and interesting kinds of projects and assignments that you all do for each of the units as we move through our Intro to Lit class. One thing that you might have noticed is that we're definitely not a read a short story, write an essay, read a poem, write an essay kind of a class. Almost every unit has us doing something fairly creative, a little bit unconventional. There's always some kind of wrinkle or quirk to it. I hope it makes the work itself a little bit more enjoyable, provides you with some sort of creative ways to engage with the works that we're reading, not just the same old analyze, write essay kind of a thing. So it sustains your interest as well. And the double bonus is that it becomes really interesting for me, since I'm not just reading a whole bunch of essays, but getting to sort of see you and hear you do lots of interesting kinds of assignments. So in almost every unit, we're doing something a little bit different, right? It's not the same thing. Hopefully that's a good thing. But it's worth, at this point, actually returning to our course description, but also more specifically our course objectives. So kind of reminding ourselves, even though we're deep in the guts of the class, like, why are we doing the various things that we're doing? And remember, our course description and our general objectives here are going to be the same, or would be the same, no matter what version of English 1130, our Intro to Lit class, that you took, whether it was honors or not honors, online, face-to-face, 8-week, 16-week, any variation. They're all going to have the same course description and objectives. How we accomplish those objectives, that, of course, will be different. So the textbooks will be different, readings might be different, assignments might be different. But at the end of the day, no matter what all that variation would be, we're still making sure that in our English 1130 classes, students are doing these objectives. So I thought I would take a moment and just kind of like remind you that we have objectives, and we can take a brief look at what they are. This, again, can help people to sort of like reframe or refocus even as you work through sort of assignment by assignment by assignment. It's easy to forget that those are all in service of a kind of larger objective, which is obviously our set of course objectives here. Most of them you'll see we kind of do all the time, even if we don't foreground the fact that we're doing them. Some of them might be worded in a way that's not totally accessible for you, but I'll try to unpack them just briefly and a little bit here. And you'll see that, again, in almost every assignment that we do, we're doing almost all of the objectives. So you'll see, hopefully across all of our readings, that there's lots of variation and diversity in terms of the genres we cover. That's kind of a given our Intro to Lit focus. So short fiction, poetry, we're getting into drama. Coming from different cultures and time periods, we've read some more recent stuff, we've read some older stuff. Place and conditions of publication, that might be a sort of foreign concept, but that is really just like how different things are published at different times. So not every short story or every poem or every whatever is published by the exact same person or entity or in the exact same way. You might even say that if an author is more or less unknown or is known for, say, a hip hop artist, but right is published in an anthology of poetry, that's kind of a variation of those conditions of publication. We looked at the yellow wallpaper, for example, and focused very specifically on the fact that it was originally published in the New England Magazine next to like a poem about a bucket and the Salem witch trials, for example. Whereas in our textbook, right, none of that is the case. So we actually looked at how some of those, even the fine nuance of those conditions of publication can maybe change the way that we interpret a work, or certain themes become way more obvious versus, right, in other instances. The inclusion of the illustrations in the original, but not throughout our textbook version. That's, again, a good example of the conditions of publication. Clearly, close reading, you're doing all the time in terms of analysis. You're finding themes and ideas, concepts that are in our work. And of course, they're grounded in evidence, quoting from the primary texts. Applying terminology and practices, again, you probably do this without even thinking about it. Anytime you use a term like imagery, symbolism, even stuff like character and plot, like it doesn't have to be complex terminology. That all has to do with terminology and using those terms to, again, practice close reading and produce literary analysis. Remember, our analyses or your analyses are being communicated in generally more creative kinds of ways, but they're still at root you analyzing texts, making comparison, finding themes, charting plot development, all of that kind of stuff. Interpreting in relation to social, cultural, historical, right? Again, thinking about those conditions of publication, who is writing this, who is it intended for, how has it been taken up in various time periods. All of that has to do with social, cultural. You might find yourself doing this especially related to Susan Glaspell's Trifles and the kind of historical context, but also her as an author, actually a multi-genre author. She was a journalist as well as a short fiction author and a playwright. Talking about material conditions again, reception, dissemination. So is a work immediately popular? Is it not, but it gains popularity? Is it interpreted one way by maybe its initial reading audience versus differently across later reading audiences? We can even think in terms of works that are then turned into a TV series or a movie or any kind of like remix of things. Again, we've actually done this quite a bit, even if you haven't necessarily thought of it. Think of our Poetry Everywhere assignment. We didn't talk about it in terms of like the material conditions of publication, but it definitely is that, finding sort of poetry out there in the world that's not really intending to be poetry, but we can see how those material conditions actually, right, we can find poetry or poetic elements even in stuff that isn't intending to be that way. The literary conventions, again, anytime we read a poem in a form, we read for variety, diversity. Oftentimes we see newer works that take up themes from older works, any kind of comparison that you've done. You might have seen how works are very similar, but also maybe have some variation on those themes. This is very much about following literary convention or challenging literary convention. And then, of course, again, we do this almost without intending or thinking about it, but looking for layers of meaning, complexity, nuance, all of those different symbolism and imagery that are available in really great literary works. That, in fact, is one of the most enjoyable. Depending on your mindset, it can be frustrating because there's no one single right answer, but oftentimes it's that very complexity that makes literary works worth returning to. So even if you read a thing once, reading it again More popular stuff often doesn't deliver like new meanings or new ideas to us, whereas more complex, or what we call literary works, often repay that investment of rereading by opening our eyes to new meanings that we hadn't seen the first time, or even challenging what we thought the certain piece meant or really focused on. All of a sudden in rereading, we find, right, complexity, nuance, and depth. So good to keep these in mind, just as no matter what approach we're taking unit to unit, we're working holistically towards these set of course objectives. By the same token, thinking holistically, as we get closer to the end of our course, you're accumulating lots of different grades. Maybe there was 1 week or one assignment or whatever that just didn't go well, missed a due date, whatever. Not a big deal. We're not going to go backwards and fix that. But at the end of the day, it'll be very clear to me and to you that those couple of off weeks were clearly that, just outliers. They're the exception, not the rule. And so I'm able to exempt those at the end of our class. All right. Again, keep in mind that I am available to email. We can face-to-face meet. We can Zoom meet if you have questions about our class, but also questions about kind of English as a major, related majors, and the variety of professions that English majors can find themselves in because of the really valuable skill set that almost any English class will provide you. I think ours in particular, creativity, effective communication, analytical skills, close reading. Those are in demand. That idea of collaboration, again, really important. Very in demand 21st century skills.